The river was moving slow that morning, the kind of slow that makes you forget how wide it really is, how dark the water gets just a meter below the surface, how much can be hiding underneath without you ever knowing. The Zambezi in its lower stretches has a way of doing that to people. It lulls you. It softens your senses with the sound of birdsong and the smell of wet mud and papyrus. And then just when you've decided it's peaceful, something surfaces beside the hull and blows a column of hot, grassy breath straight into your face. That morning, the crew of a small river charter vessel, operating out of a camp near the Zimbabwean bank, had set out before sunrise. They had passengers on board, a small group of wildlife researchers, and a documentary team, all of them more interested in birds and elephants than in anything that might come from below. The plan was a straightforward river transit. Move upstream, observe, film what needed filming, return before midday. Simple, routine. The kind of trip the captain had done dozens of times. What happened instead became one of the most talked about encounters in the history of that stretch of river. A single hippo, an adult male, surfaced less than 20 meters off the starboard bow, somewhere around the first hour of the journey. He didn't dive, he didn't yawn, he didn't give any of the usual signals that experienced river guides read as warning. He simply looked at the boat. Then he began to follow. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time. What you're about to hear gets stranger, more tense, and ultimately more remarkable than almost anything the natural world has offered in recent memory. Stay with this. The hippopotamus is the third largest land mammal on the planet. An adult bull can weigh over 4,000 kilograms. Its jaws can open to nearly 180 degrees and generate a bite force estimated at around 1,800 pounds per square inch. Enough to snap a canoe clean in two, which hippos have done, to people who never saw it coming. They kill more humans in Africa than almost any other large animal. Not through predation, but through territorial aggression, through surprise, through the simple physics of what happens when 4,000 kilograms of muscle decides that something in its path needs to be removed. They are, by any reasonable measure, one of the most dangerous animals a person can encounter in open water. And this one was following the boat. Not alongside it. Not cutting across its wake out of curiosity. Following it. Matching its speed. Maintaining a distance of roughly 15 to 20 meters off the stern, adjusting when the throttle changed, correcting when the vessel angled toward one bank or the other. The researchers noticed it within the first 10 minutes. By the time 30 minutes had passed, no one on board was watching birds anymore. River guides who work the Zambezi will tell you that hippos are unpredictable in ways that other dangerous animals are not. A buffalo is dangerous, and it signals its danger. An elephant communicates through body language that experienced guides can read with reasonable accuracy. A crocodile follows rules of engagement that, while terrifying, are largely consistent. But a hippo exists in a behavioral space that even the most seasoned watermen describe with a kind of helpless honesty. You just don't always know. That is the phrase they use. You just don't always know. The bull that was following the vessel that morning showed no obvious signs of aggression in the traditional sense. His ears were not pinned back. He was not vocalizing, not releasing the pink oily secretion that serves as both sunscreen and stress indicator, not presenting his tusks in the wide open-mouthed yawn that is actually a threat display and not a yawn at all. He was just following, calm, deliberate, and entirely unexplained. The captain had been on this river for 11 years. He had been charged by hippos twice, both times in narrower channels where the animals felt cornered or where a mother had young nearby. He had seen bulls posturing against one another in deep water, had watched them tear into each other with 400-millimeter tusks that can curve outward like scimitars, leaving wounds on each other that take weeks to close. He knew this animal. He knew what it was capable of, and he later said, in the written account he filed with the Wildlife Authority, that the thing that unsettled him most was not that the hippo was following them, it was that he had no framework for why. The river here is wide. In places, the channel spreads to nearly 400 meters across. There is no shortage of room for a hippo to submerge, cut away, and disappear. The water is deep enough for them to walk the bottom in near total invisibility if they choose to. This animal had every opportunity to disengage. Instead, he surfaced every 4 to 6 minutes in almost exactly the same position relative to the boat, slightly off-center to starboard, roughly 15 to 20 meters back, watching. By the second hour, the research team had begun documenting him in earnest. One of the biologists on board had worked hippo behavior for a portion of her career, and she noted several things that she found immediately unusual. His body posture in the water was relaxed. His movement was efficient, but not hurried. He was not breathing in the shortened, stressed patterns that indicate agitation. Whatever he was doing, he did not appear to be in distress, and he did not appear to be working himself toward an attack. He appeared, and this is the word she used in her own notes, curious. Hippos are not generally understood to be curious in the way that cetaceans or elephants or primates are curious. They are territorial, hierarchical, and intensely social within their own pods, but they do not typically display what behavioral ecologists would classify as investigative behavior toward objects or species outside their social group. They respond to threats. They respond to rivals. They respond to the demands of their own biological rhythms, the need to graze at night, to submerge and thermoregulate by day, to protect their stretch of river from incursion. Sustained, non-aggressive interest in a moving vessel is not a behavior that appears with any frequency in the literature. And yet here he was, following, watching, surfacing, following again. The Zambezi does not keep its secrets gently. It imposes them. The channel in the third hour of the journey narrowed, where a long sandbar pushed the navigable water toward the northern bank, and the captain reduced speed to thread the passage carefully. When he did, the Hippo closed the distance. He came up to within 8 or 9 meters of the stern, near enough that the people at the back of the boat could see the barnacle-like texture of the skin around his ears, the deep pink of the gum line where his lower canines emerged from the jaw, the slight flare of the nostrils as he exhaled. Near enough that they could feel, not just hear, the exhalation. A wet, warm, grass-scented pressure of air. Nobody moved. The biologist kept her camera running on a continuous record, not lifting it to her eye, just pointing it at the water. The documentary cameraman, more accustomed to holding his ground for shots, later admitted that he gripped the rail harder than he had ever gripped anything in his professional life. The captain did not increase speed. He understood something that the passengers were only beginning to understand. A sudden change in the boat's behavior might be interpreted as a threat or as flight, and neither of those interpretations would serve them well. A threatened hippo is a charging hippo. A fleeing object is a target. The best option, the only real option, was to continue at the same pace, maintain the same acoustic and visual signature, and let the animal make its own decisions in its own time. So they moved through the narrows at low throttle, and the hippo moved with them. There is a broader truth about the Zambezi that is worth knowing before going further. This river is not wilderness, in the way that word is often used romantically to mean empty or untouched. It is a river that runs through one of the densest concentrations of wildlife in southern Africa, but it is also a river that has been traveled by humans for thousands of years. The hippopods that live in it have been aware of human presence for all of their lives, and for generations before that. They have learned to categorize the things that move on the water. Motorboats are not unknown to them. The sound of an outboard is not a novelty. Most hippos, in most circumstances, treat river vessels with something between indifference and mild territorial irritation. What made this bull remarkable was not simply that he noticed the boat. It was the sustained, apparently intentional quality of his attention. 11 years on the river, the captain had never seen anything like it. Around the 4th hour, they passed into a stretch of river that the guides refer to locally by a name that translates roughly as the Long Open, a several-kilometer section where the banks recede and the floodplain widens, and the water spreads thin and glittering under the midday sky. This is not deep hippo country. The water here is rarely more than 1.5 meters, dropping to less than 1 meter in places during the dry season months. Hippos move through it, but they don't tend to hold territory there. It is exposed and shallow, uncomfortable for an animal that needs depth to thermoregulate and to feel secure. The bull came through it anyway, moving with his body angled slightly forward, his legs working the sandy bottom, his back and the wide dome of his head just above the surface, pushing a small bow wave of his own. He was working harder than he had been in deep water. It was costing him something to follow the boat through that section. He did it anyway. The biologist watching from the stern later wrote that this was the moment when she shifted from thinking about the encounter in terms of threat assessment to thinking about it in terms of something more interesting. She had no clean explanation. She still doesn't. But the fact that the animal pushed through shallow, exposed, energetically costly terrain to maintain contact with the vessel suggested to her that whatever was driving the behavior was not incidental. It was not a hippo who happened to be moving in the same direction. It was a hippo who had decided, in whatever way a hippo decides things, that following this boat was worth the effort. By the time 4.5 hours had passed, and the vessel had covered approximately 12 kilometers from the point where the bull first appeared, the captain had already been in radio contact with the camp twice. The first call was to report the situation. The second was to discuss the problem that had been building in the back of everyone's mind since about the second hour. They were going to have to dock. The camp's small jetty and landing facility were another hour and a half upstream. The boat needed to return. Passengers needed to be put ashore. Fuel resupply was required. All of this was true and practical and unavoidable and completely overshadowed by one question that nobody on the radio exchange seemed entirely comfortable asking directly. What happens when they stop moving? A vessel moving at constant speed on open water is a dynamic object. It has a defined relationship with anything following it. The follower is behind, the followed is ahead, the geometry is clear, and the encounter has a legible structure. But a vessel that decelerates, that angles toward a bank, that cuts its engine and allows its hull to settle against a wooden dock, that changes everything. The dynamic relationship dissolves. Distance collapses. The thing that was following arrives. The Hippo had not touched the boat. He had not bumped it, had not rocked it, had not surfaced beneath it. For more than 4 hours, he had simply tracked it with the patient, unhurried attention of an animal that had decided, for reasons entirely its own, to maintain proximity. But every person on board understood that this was not a guarantee of anything. A hippo that has followed you for 12 kilometers is still a hippo. The camp manager, listening on the radio, suggested they try to redirect the animal before reaching the dock. This is a technique that experienced guides use when hippos position themselves too close to landing areas, particularly when there are tourists involved. You move the boat across the animal's bow, forcing it to alter course, using the vessel itself as a kind of moving wall to push the hippo away from the direction you want to go. It requires a hippo that is in a predictable, readable behavioral state. It requires a hippo that responds to the geometry of the situation in expected ways. Everyone on the radio understood the implicit problem with this plan. The captain tried it anyway. He brought the boat gently to starboard, cutting a diagonal path toward the southern bank, putting the vessel between the bull and the open channel, trying to encourage the animal to hold south while the boat angled north toward the dock. The bull came with them, not aggressively, not with any obvious challenge, but with the same quiet persistence he had shown for the past 4 hours. He adjusted course as the boat adjusted course. He surfaced in the same position. The technique did not work. There is something philosophically interesting about what happens to experienced professionals when the tools they trust stop working. The captain had been trained in a repertoire of responses to hippo encounters, and that repertoire had served him well across 11 years and hundreds of river transits. Now each tool he reached for came back without purchase. Increase speed. He had tried it. The hippo kept pace. Redirect the animal. The animal was not redirectable. Maintain course and wait for the hippo to disengage. 4 hours had passed, and the hippo had not disengaged. The dock was 40 minutes away and getting closer, and nothing in his training gave him a clean answer for what came next. The biologist had a suggestion that was not in any safety manual, but that made a certain biological sense. She had been watching the bull's behavior throughout the journey and had noticed that his attention seemed most intensely focused on the engine itself, or more specifically, on the stern section of the boat directly above the propeller. Hippos are highly sensitive to low-frequency vibration. It is part of how they communicate with each other, through a combination of audible vocalizations and subaudible infrasonic calls that travel through both water and ground. She theorized, and it was only a theory, that there was something in the acoustic signature of the outboard motor that was producing a vibration pattern within the range that hippos use for social communication. Not a threat call, not a distress signal, something else, something that might have sounded, through the particular physics of water and hull and engine, like a familiar voice. Whether this was the real explanation, nobody knows. The Zambezi does not offer easy answers. What it offered that afternoon was a dock, approaching fast, a hippo 12 meters off the stern, and a decision that had to be made. The captain made it the way experienced people in genuinely novel situations sometimes have to make decisions, by accepting that he did not know what the outcome would be and moving forward anyway. He brought the throttle down, he let the boat slow, he let it angle toward the dock at the kind of gradual, unhurried pace that sends the least possible provocation into the water. He instructed the passengers to move forward, away from the stern, to sit low and stay quiet. The documentary cameraman kept filming. The boat slowed. The hippo slowed with it. The boat came alongside the dock at half throttle, then at idle, then with the engine cut. The last 100 meters were covered in near silence, except for the sound of the water against the hull, and the sound of a 4,000-kilogram animal breathing in the river, 15 meters behind them. When the engine stopped, the Hippo stopped too. He held his position in the water, just off the end of the dock, that wide, heavy head just above the surface, ears rotating slowly as they always do, reading the air. The crew looped the mooring lines. The passengers did not move. For approximately 4 minutes, nothing happened. The Hippo floated. The boat sat at the dock. The afternoon light came off the water at a low angle and turned the surface the color of old bronze, and nobody spoke. Then the bull sank. Not explosively, not with any apparent alarm, just a slow subsidence, like a stone lowered carefully into still water, until there was nothing above the surface but the faint ripple of his passage, and then even that was gone. He did not surface again near the dock. He did not appear in the stretch of river downstream. The researchers watched the water for 30 minutes after docking, scanning both banks, both directions with binoculars. Nothing. Wherever he went after that, he went quietly and completely, and without any further demonstration of whatever it was that had driven 4 hours and 14 kilometers of behavior that no one on board could satisfactorily explain. The biologist filed a formal behavioral observation report with the Regional Wildlife Authority. The captain wrote his own account and gave it to the camp records. The documentary footage was reviewed by 2 other behavioral ecologists who were consulted independently. Neither of them had a clean explanation. One used the word anomalous. The other said that without longitudinal data on this specific individual, meaning without knowing who this bull was, what his history was, whether he had previous associations with boats or with humans, any explanation was largely speculative. Both of them said it was one of the most remarkable river encounters they had heard of. To understand why this matters, it helps to understand something about hippopotamus social structure and individual behavior that rarely makes it into the popular understanding of these animals. Hippos are not simply aggressive territory-holding machines, though they are certainly capable of ferocious territorial defense. They are cognitively complex animals with rich social lives, strong individual personalities, and documented capacity for what researchers cautiously describe as relationship formation. Within pods, individual hippos recognize each other, not just by scent and sound, but by something that functions very much like personal familiarity. Dominant bulls know the specific vocalizations of the animals in their territory. Females know each other's young. Juveniles play together in ways that suggest something more than instinctive role-filling. What they do not typically do is form relationships with objects, or with species, outside their social world. And yet the behavioral literature, when you dig into it, contains more outliers than the popular narrative suggests. There are documented cases of hippos associating with specific boats on specific stretches of river over periods of weeks. There are records from wildlife researchers in the Congo Basin of a subadult male who repeatedly sought proximity to a survey vessel in ways that suggested something other than territorial response. There are accounts from local fishermen on Lake Tanganyika of individual hippos that became, over years, essentially habituated to specific human presences in ways that the fishermen described using language that, translated, amounts to something like knowing each other. None of this explains what happened on the Zambezi that afternoon, but it places it within a broader picture of an animal whose inner life is considerably richer and considerably less well understood than the flat characterization of hippos as simply dangerous suggests. The question of why this specific bull followed that specific boat for that specific distance remains open. The acoustic hypothesis, the idea that the engine produced something resembling a social call, is the most mechanistically plausible explanation, but it has never been tested under the conditions of that encounter and may never be. There is a second hypothesis, less scientific but worth considering, that the bull had a prior history with boats on that stretch of river, that something in his early life had created an association between the sound and movement of a motor vessel and something other than threat, and that he was, in the wordless way that large-brained animals sometimes are, simply acting out of memory. A third hypothesis is the most uncomfortable one for people who prefer their wildlife to be legible, that this was an individual animal doing something individual, something not reducible to instinct or conditioning or evolutionary pressure alone, but something that arose from whatever particular configuration of experience and cognition and moment existed inside one specific hippopotamus on one specific afternoon on a river that does not offer easy answers. The dock held, the boat was secured, the passengers disembarked onto solid ground and spent a long time not saying much, which is often what happens when something real occurs in a place where the scale of things is genuinely larger than you are. There is a code that operates on African rivers, not a written code, not a formal one, but a real one nonetheless. It is the code by which people who work in those places every day maintain their lives in proximity to animals that are more powerful, more dangerous, and more present than almost anything a person from a city can easily conceptualize. The code is built on attention, on the refusal to pretend that you understand something you don't understand, on the recognition that the river is not a park, not a set, not a backdrop, but an actual place where actual things live and die, and follow boats for reasons they are not required to explain to you. The captain understood this. He had understood it for 11 years. What the afternoon added to his understanding was simply one more piece of evidence for something he already believed, which is that the river is always doing something you haven't seen before, and the correct response to not having seen it before is not to panic and not to pretend, and not to reach for an explanation that flattens the thing into something smaller than it is. The correct response is to move carefully, watch honestly, and let the animal make its own choices. He said later, in a conversation at the camp that evening, that if he had to guess, and he was clear that it was only a guess, he thought the bull had been alone. Not in the temporary way that a young male is alone when he's been pushed out of a pod by a dominant bull and is waiting for a chance to establish himself elsewhere. He meant alone in a deeper sense. Displaced from a territory, separated from a pod, moving through a stretch of river that was not his, and that offered him no social anchor. And that the boat, moving with purpose and consistency, generating its steady, low-frequency hum into the water, had offered something, not companionship exactly, but proximity, the sense of something moving in the same direction, the oldest comfort there is. Whether this is true, nobody knows. The hippo is gone, and does not file reports. What remains is the footage, 14 kilometers of river transit, one large male hippopotamus maintaining position 15 to 20 meters off the stern of a small motor vessel across 4.5 hours, through deep channels and shallow sandbars and a narrows passage, and finally to a dock where, after 4 minutes of floating quiet, he sank and was gone. The footage has been reviewed by wildlife biologists and river ecologists and behavioral researchers. The consensus is that there is no consensus. It happened, it is documented. It does not fit neatly into the existing literature, and the existing literature is, accordingly, slightly less complete than it was before that morning. This is not a failure of science. This is how science actually works, when it is being honest, when the people doing it have enough respect for the thing they are studying to resist the temptation to make it smaller than it is. The hippo was not performing for the camera. The hippo did not care about the camera. The hippo was doing something that mattered to the hippo, for reasons the hippo understood and communicated to no one, in a language that the river keeps for itself. The Zambezi runs for 2,500 kilometers from its source in northwestern Zambia to its mouth on the Mozambique coast. In all of that distance, across all of the centuries that human beings have traveled it and lived beside it and feared it and revered it, the river has accumulated more stories than any record can hold. Stories about crocodiles and flash floods and hippo charges and night crossings that went wrong and things seen at low water that no one quite believed afterward. The story of the bull who followed the boat is now one of those stories. It will be told at camps along the river, the way those stories are always told, quietly, in the evenings, with a certain careful respect for the fact that the animal in question is almost certainly still out there somewhere, still moving through that dark, slow water, still entirely its own explanation. The dock held, the ropes held, the hippo sank, and the river moved on the way it always does, wide and brown and unhurried, giving nothing away. The hippo populations of the Zambezi and its tributaries have declined significantly over the past 3 decades. Legal and illegal hunting, habitat encroachment, agricultural pressure on river margins, and competition for water resources have combined to push the species into a status that conservation bodies now classify as vulnerable, with some regional subpopulations in considerably more precarious condition than that broad term suggests. The Zambezi Basin still holds one of the larger concentrations of hippopotamus in Africa, but the numbers are not what they were, and the pressures on them are not diminishing. The territories that individual bulls hold, the stretches of river they defend and patrol and move through over the course of their lives, are increasingly bounded by human infrastructure, by irrigation abstractions, by the noise and chemical signature of intensified riverine agriculture. What this means practically is that the behavioral range of hippopotamus in places like the Middle Zambezi is changing. Animals are moving through corridors they would not historically have used. Social structures are being disrupted by population pressures that push young males out of pods earlier and into territories that are less viable than they once were. The displacement dynamic that the captain speculated about when he suggested the bull might be alone, might be socially unmoored, is not a fringe possibility. It is increasingly common. The animals that wildlife researchers see behaving in novel or unexpected ways are often animals whose normal social architecture has been disrupted, animals for whom the usual rules of their world are no longer fully operational, animals improvising in the space between what they know and what they are finding. This is worth holding on to when thinking about the encounter on the river that morning. The bull